And I suspect that the lesson of history would have to be that a multipolar world is actually an even more dangerous world.
I think that's correct. I mean, if you think about the situation we face today, we have the possibility of a great power war in East Asia between the United States and China. And we have the possibility of a great power war in Eastern Europe between the United States and Russia. We, in effect, have two Cold Wars. And I would argue that in the case of the US-China competition, that Cold War, the one that we now see in East Asia, is more dangerous than the Cold War that existed in Europe during the period from 1947 to 1989. Now you say to yourself, why do I say that? Why am I saying that this situation in East Asia is more dangerous than the situation in Central Europe during the Cold War? Well, during the Cold War, when we thought about the possibility of NATO and the Warsaw Pact fighting in the center of Europe, everybody realized that this would be a war between two massive military forces that were armed to the teeth with thousands of nuclear weapons. And the end result, if that war started, was there was a good chance that we would all be incinerated. And given that possible outcome, nobody would want to start a war. War was so horrible, the thought of war was so horrible, that the likelihood was very, very small. If you think about East Asia today, we're talking about a possible conflict breaking out over the South China Sea, over the East China Sea, or over Taiwan. These are wars that in scale would be much smaller than a war would have been in Central Europe during the Cold War. It's easy to imagine a war breaking out over the South China Sea, or over Taiwan, or over the East China Sea. So what I'm saying here is, because the consequences of a US-China war would not be as great as the consequences of a US-Soviet war in Central Europe during the Cold War, the likelihood of war in East Asia today is greater than it was in the Cold War. And I want to be clear here. I'm not saying it is likely that we're going to have a war in East Asia and that we should all get ready for, a war to break out. That's not my point. My point is that it is more likely that you'll have a war in East Asia than it was that you would have a war in Central Europe during the Cold War. And point number two is, you now have two great power competitions, two Cold Wars, one in Europe and one in East Asia. Whereas during the Cold War, it was a bipolar world, and you had one Cold War involving the United States and the Soviet Union. So we live in very dangerous times.
朋友都知道我是很挑剔的，防晒乳我选 KS 皇家呵护抗光清爽高防晒凝露，因为它有媲美蓝光神盾的抓藻植萃，保护我在阳光下延缓肌肤老化，维持青春弹力，可以防御工作环境里的3C 商品。 各种光源对肌肤的伤害，擦起来清爽不黏腻。我特别喜欢它做到海洋友善，365天，天天抗光抗老化，是我的保养日常。你呢？呵护您，呵护全家人，专属你的 KS Royal Care 抗光清爽高防晒凝露。